So it's been a week now since the drama started around Marathon and the art plagiarism issue. Yes, it's been discussed a lot, but this is a really big deal. Looking back to the original tweet from Anti-Real, when they revealed that they'd found some of their artwork hidden in Marathon. When I say hidden, it wasn't really hidden, because it was in stinking plain sight and very obvious. Ultimately though, what's in plain sight now is that tweet about the lifted assets has had more than 10 million views on X. And as some other folks have said, that's a kind of marketing that is incredibly difficult to achieve in video games in general. Anybody publishing a game would love for its announcement to get 10 million views. Except of course in this instance, that is very, very, very negative press for Bungie, which is going to do some serious damage to Marathon, even more than what had already been done with the announcement and the alpha. Of course, it's been a big conversation in our community, but also the wider gaming community. Basically everyone knows about this, which is just dreadful press for Bungie. And as a result of everything that's kicked off in the last couple of weeks, Bungie have had even more bad press. Not all of it is strictly associated with Marathon, as ex-developers are now speaking out regarding Destiny as well. So recently, content creator Destin Legary, who you may remember from Fireteam chat back in the day, had the opportunity to speak to a bunch of ex-Bungie staff, where he first indicates that there was a suggestion of making Destiny 2 a subscription model. So he said in one meeting, adding a subscription to Destiny was brought up, only to be vehemently shut down by staff, and that's an indication of a sort of battle between the leaders at Bungie and the developers, who obviously pushed back against that idea, suggesting that it wouldn't be a good thing. And they also speak about an obsession with monetization. One example is that some leaders were apparently worried that a Trials of Osiris PvP armor set looked too good, fearing that it might make players less likely to spend money in the Eververse store. And I think that's in relation to the Trials armor we have right now that has the glows and all of that stuff. So not only do we see examples of bad leadership, but also examples of developers on the ground at Bungie who are actually pushing back against what they believe to be bad ideas, and especially the sort of anti-player friendly concepts that are being pushed by leadership. On top of that, he reports, universally, HR at Bungie was highlighted as a major issue. Ex-employees claimed that HR was working within their own interest, and there were accusations that issues of harassment were being covered up, and one person was estimated to have departed Bungie as a HR employee with as much as $5 million, which is absolute insanity. And reportedly, HR were keeping an eye on what Bungie developers were doing inside and outside of the studio, and if folks who work at Bungie spoke out publicly on social media, whether it was a personal issue or promoting their own work, they'd often receive emails as soon as 15 minutes later, where employees were warned against promoting themselves publicly. And developers in these interviews also suggested that they hope Bungie get consolidated into Sony, with that being the only path forward that they can really see. And so it's really obvious that developers across Bungie, both making Destiny and Marathon content, have had a lot of issues with the leadership at the company for some time. So that's worth reporting on. But back to Marathon and the art issue. It is of course made worse because this isn't a unique thing. We've seen it happen before, like the artwork that was copied in a cutscene for Destiny before the final shape, and the instance where Bungie lifted the design for the Ace of Spades Nerf ornament, which even contained identical brush strokes applied to the version that was added to Destiny 2. Bungie have a serious issue, which spans between very, very heavily inspired and, well, straight up plagiarized. There's been extra reporting though in the last week about how this is affecting the studio in general. I think it's safe to say that the leadership at Bungie at this point pretty much needs gutting. If we look at the past few years, the number of mistakes that have been made across expanding Bungie, the deal that they made with Sony, the incubation projects, one of which is Marathon, the other is Gummy Bears, which has now totally been absorbed by Sony, and the fact that Bungie leadership appear to have misled the studio and mismanaged the situation in terms of the studio's capability to actually produce multiple IPs and to allocate the resources in order for devs to actually do that. At this point, we're pretty sure that the only way Bungie will really improve is when its current leadership is out of the equation. New reporting from Paul Tassi, though, in the past few days speaks about morale in the studio, launch worries around Marathon, and significant changes that they've made to their plans. Firstly, we had the closed alpha, which didn't really do a good job of selling the game. Following that, this whole art plagiarism thing has taken place, and according to Paul Tassi, folks who still work at the studio have said that Bungie and Sony Legal are now sorting through this and have launched an audit into all of the assets in the game and their potential origins. It's not clear how long this will take. Firstly, they need to find everything that's been plagiarized and then actually remove and replace those things, which is a pretty expansive process, and that's why Bungie didn't even show off any footage of the game in their recent livestream last week, because they couldn't be sure exactly what they were showing and whether the content that they were previewing actually entirely belongs to Bungie, which is a massive, massive problem. As a result of this, Paul Tasser reports that according to devs, morale is in free fall across all departments and the vibes have never been worse at the studio. Developers on the ground at Bungie have major concerns about what happens to the studio if Marathon bombs, and there's an acknowledgement that Bungie can't afford for that to happen. Bungie developers also appear to recognize what is an actively hostile environment with regards to Marathon and perception around the game, and how that poses a massive issue for a potential September release. And of course, that's on top of the fact that Bungie can't significantly rework the game in that time, or should we say expand the game, which is ultimately probably what Marathon needs more than anything, with the exception of removing stolen art assets. Developers have gone on to indicate, though, that at the start of May, Bungie actually pulled the plug on a major plan for summer marketing around Marathon. So the idea was to have a new trailer in June, along with the launch of pre-orders for the game, but they've said that entire campaign now needs to be reworked. On top of that, though, they were planning a public beta in August, which was also going to be heavily marketed with these announcements that were planned for June, but that beta may actually be pulled and changed for a roadmap of public playtests. So even as we speak, Bungie are completely reconfiguring their Marathon plans. The marketing campaign is essentially out the window for now, and of course it's also possible that that marketing additionally contains plagiarized items, assets, which we've referenced before. So the likelihood that Marathon gets some kind of a delay from a technical perspective has increased significantly based on what we've learned in the past week. That is not yet confirmed to be the case, but between auditing the entire game and having to change a bunch of assets, scrapping the marketing campaign because their current approach hasn't been working, and of course, any potential changes that Bungie want to make before the game actually drops, we've gone from a situation where Bungie were essentially saying, no, the game is going to launch the way it is and then we're going to build upon it, to a situation where it suddenly seems more likely that a delay could happen. Although reportedly that hasn't been discussed more widely at the studio just yet, so it's possible those conversations are happening between Bungie and Sony, but currently there's no announcement on that front. Otherwise, devs inside the studio have said that Marathon was originally pitched by Bungie leadership, but as far back as 5 years ago, devs were telling them what would and would not work, and were often ignored, and many developers have indicated that they'd said that the game needs to have some kind of PvE component. However, the leadership at Bungie basically told them, we know best, do as you're told. And so developers have continued pushing forward with Marathon's plan, while personally holding a belief that the overall concept and the planned delivery for the game initially at launch is something which is going to be very problematic. So I can imagine there's been a lot of frustration between Bungie developers, both throughout the development process overall, but also in situations like this, seeing the reception to the alpha, and then the further massive issue that's been caused by this plagiarism scandal. When I've defended people who work at Bungie previously, I've got a bit of stick in the comment section, where folks have basically said, no, everyone who works for Bungie is the same, none of them want this game to do well, and I just don't believe that's true. When you work for a big company, let's be real, you do what you're told to do. And given that some of these developers on Marathon are the same ones who've brought us some of the best Destiny content that we've had, I simply don't buy into the idea that none of them care about making a good game. But it is clear that the leadership at Bungie are far more focused on trying to follow video game trends even when they're pretty late to the party, which is certainly the case for Marathon, and ultimately crunching the developer team to get a product out of the door at a certain point in time. And this probably isn't helped by their relationship with Sony, because Bungie sold the idea that they are live service geniuses, right? And that's what Sony bought into, probably with promises of when Bungie could actually deliver on a new product like Marathon. And who knows, Marathon internally may have already been pushed back a couple of times at this point. So ultimately, that very bad decision making within the leadership of Bungie trickles down, and it's the developers who end up having an absolutely horrible time. And ultimately, it's also those folks who lose their jobs when these products don't release the way that Bungie want them to, right? So it's got to be a really horrible situation. On top of that, the game post shared, speaking to a former Bungie developer who posted to Blue Sky, they said, as someone who worked on Marathon, I feel for those still at the studio, and working with the engineering and Marathon leadership was extremely toxic and humiliating. I won't speak about the rest, but Bungie leadership needs to be gutted completely. This is someone who's actually worked at the studio, who described a daily reality of working under that leadership as being extremely toxic and humiliating. Plus, they described rampant mismanagement, frequent toxicity, and violations of Bungie's core values, with no ability to execute on their multi-franchise vision. And again, there are indications of lower level developers being shut down by leadership, essentially being told that they're not allowed to speak on certain issues, again echoing that sentiment that Bungie leadership appear to know best. So between what we've seen over the past few years, poor decision making around the Destiny franchise, which has been Bungie's bread and butter, no doubt they've lost a lot of cash there by underinvesting in the past few years, and ultimately that's where a Destiny 3 or a rebirth of the franchise was required but has not happened. Bungie have instead funneled that money into expanding the studio, spending a lot of money on real estate in Bellevue, Washington of all places, which is extremely expensive, trying to spin up multiple projects at the same time with smaller teams than originally worked on games like Destiny. And then when things have gone wrong, obviously we've seen rounds of layoffs. There've already been 2 big rounds of layoffs. I'm sure other restructuring has gone under the radar as well in terms of public reporting. One of these rounds of layoffs was following the Final Shape, which was a critically acclaimed Destiny expansion. That's what you get for doing good work, apparently. And now the whole plagiarism situation, which may well have been fueled by Bungie putting so much crunch onto the dev team, reports about toxicity, developers having serious concerns about the overall concept of Marathon, but being shut down by higher-ups and leaders at the studio. It's incredibly clear at this point that while Bungie have had a lot of success over the years, the people currently leading that studio are making repeated mistakes when it comes to the projects that they're putting time into, where they're spending the resources, and the fact that they're ignoring developers who've actually produced some of their best content, at least over the past decade. And I think at this point it is incredibly clear, much like developers themselves have said, that Bungie's leadership needs to be gutted and the studio managed in a completely different way. Obviously, I'm sure that many of the leaders at Bungie are holding out to get massive paychecks once Marathon actually drops. They want to keep hold of their shares, and it may be the case that in a year or so's time, people like Pete Parsons will be gone. Based on everything we've seen, that's looking increasingly likely. Of course, Pete Parsons is the CEO, so he's a name that all of us know, and we've heard drama about people like that in the past, but there'll be a whole host of other folks who are coordinating Bungie and making these decisions. And I think it probably is the case, perception-wise, that if the leadership are replaced or Sony take over the company, then that may actually be a thing which gives Bungie and games like Destiny in particular, which still has scope to be successful, at least if we base that on the performance of Final Shape less than a year ago, there may be some hope for Bungie and Destiny overall. But I very much doubt that any of that lies within the current setup over there at Bungie. So there we go, that's a bunch of additional reporting over the past few days. It's been an absolutely wild situation, so please give us any of your thoughts down in the comment section on it, and if you've at least found this update interesting, then a rating below really would help us out as well. I'll keep you up to date if we get any additional details, but otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will catch you guys very soon.